In this next thrilling session with Benjamin Stokes, we will explore how libraries across 59 cities and towns have transformed local history into an interactive adventure. Imagine texting with sculptures, embarking on audio scavenger hunts, and even using AI to breathe new life into old monuments. In this talk, we'll unveil 5 secret recipes that any town can use to create their own historical escapades. So grab your virtual magnifying glass and let's dive deep into the past.
Hello. Yeah, I do want to show you some of what the libraries have made in 59 cities and towns. You'll see a little of that. But more importantly, I want to pitch this as a design space that all of us should be thinking about more as a community. Is that loud enough? People can hear? Yep. I'm Ben Stokes. I run something called the Playful City Lab at the American University Game Center in Washington, D.C. We've been, for a number of years, working on this question of how can cities be playful, but also how can that play strengthen our connection to each other, to community, and to our sense of place and belonging in the world. So I'm going to show you some of those examples, but we do need to question some of the assumptions that are often made at a conference around digital games about what are some of the basic infrastructure for making games and play. And of course, that infrastructure is changing. Just a little louder. Just like in the digital world, things are changing. Apple Vision, whatever you think of Apple Vision, it's new, and it does provide some interesting provocations. Cities, of course, are also changing. I don't know if you tried to bike in New York like 10 or 20 years ago, but it was a very different experience before the bike infrastructure that's been put in has totally changed what it means to bike in the city. And this has implications for libraries and all sorts of places that are place-based, including things like library bookmobiles, which have been around in different forms for a long time, but e-bikes are really changing how libraries can get out. And in New York City, that may not matter hugely, but think about small rural communities where libraries have to really get out to a lot of different places. E-bikes can really change things dramatically. The infrastructure for telling stories is also changing in our cities. And I wanted to just point to this short story dispenser that's photographed here in a Bay Area rapid transit station, but they've been popping up actually not just in the United States, all around the world. It started in France. There's a whole movement of these things. I've seen them in airports. I've just run into them in a number of places. You all may have seen them as well. And I think these are really interesting because they often tell short stories that have been written by young people locally. And you can get one printed out, read it on the plane, read it on BART. It's a different mode than thinking we have to do everything digital. The future of innovation is not just digital. It's analog, like the bikes, and it's hybrid. It's the combination of both of those things. And sometimes that includes interesting digital things for physical spaces, like the tap cards that are on buses. We've been experimenting with what does it mean to do storytelling, where you tap to tell stories, not just screen-based, but object-based. Museums have been doing a lot of this work inside, but our lab is really interested in outside. What about public spaces? What about buses? How do we tell the stories of our places, especially for all voices that live there? And sometimes that requires analog. So I like the infrastructure of furniture to keep thinking, going back and asking ourselves, how is furniture changing? How can it change? And sometimes it changes in low-tech ways because somebody just put this there, right? This wasn't there yesterday. Doesn't mean it's more technologically advanced. It just means it's changing, right? And all of us can change our built environments in small ways. Sometimes those ways are through a big formal change. Some ways it's a small appropriation. We're going to be talking a little about those. This journey for us that we've been doing with libraries in a bunch of cities actually started in some ways. One of its roots is in a project where my lab was funded by the makers of Pokemon Go. So Niantic paid for us to fly around to a bunch of different US cities, along with the Knight Foundation, and look at how they were appropriating the game to build local connections. Often that involved design that most players never even saw. unless you were one of the 10,000 plus players in San Jose that played it as part of their open streets adventure. Or in Philadelphia, this is a cool project with libraries where they made a paper activity, a kind of poke crawl that you would get out and go around the neighborhood and see some of the assets that are there, including this amazing Keith Haring mural that the neighborhood is really proud of in South Philly, right? This is a mural that they really care about, and it's something that they use to identify their sense of place and community. Well, this mural and the game work together partly because you could still play, you could do the tour with just the game, but also if you loved Pokemon, and you just had the paper, as a lot of kids do, and as also a lot of low-income people who may have a smartphone these days, but not necessarily a data plan. And this is something I think we're not talking about Games for Change enough. Simply having a device is not the same as saying you have data outside. And libraries in a democracy are incredibly powerful because they are about that universal access. The demos is right, all of us, right? Which means we have to start in a deep central way with radical access to technology for all people. And this paper augmentation, this is augmented reality, paper style, right? This is part of AR, and this is a part of the future of AR and XR. We got really inspired by this today. And this is a low-cost game in some ways that was made on top of Pokemon Go. And can there be more of these? Well, we've been finding out, yes. Over the past 3 years, we've done several different cohorts with different libraries around the country, training them in game design with a tool called Hive Mechanic. Partly because when we looked at tools, we're like, Unity is not necessarily the answer. I mean, I love Unity and we teach Unity, but also what about other kinds of tools? So we made a kind of game engine and an authoring system that doesn't require anything too fancy. We have a whole team. Shout out to our folks, some of whom are in the room, who have been working on this project. And we're often building on a book that I put out in 2000 called Locally Played, which is about how games can make places stronger. A lot of the examples in that book, though, were expensive. So we are right now incredibly focused on low cost. And when I say low cost, I don't mean under 100,000. No, I mean like under 1,000, maybe even under $100. What does it mean to make games in that space? So libraries are telling us some of the answer. And we're putting together a kind of recipe book. We're interested in what are the atomic units of like small bits of game that libraries can build on, because often they haven't seen games like this either. They are much more aware of Pokemon Go than the Poke Crawl, right? Comparatively, we have to do a lot of work to make the Poke Crawl more visible. Okay, so things that the libraries made, sometimes they start in a pretty ordinary looking place. This is Milton in Wisconsin, and in the pandemic, they were focused on their outdoor area. This is a story garden they had there, and it includes this sculpture, which has some birds in it. They made next to it this signpost, which includes a sign that says, "Caw, see us birds? You can text with us, caw." Text the word hello to the phone number. Here's an interesting thing, though, you might not have realized about the infrastructure in your pocket. QR codes don't just go to menus and URLs. You can use a QR code to pre-start a text conversation. So when you scan this QR code, you don't have to enter the phone number, and it even pre-fills the first part of hello, and then you can add more. And they start texting with the birds. What do the birds say back? Hello, look up. We are the birds on the Story Gardens arch. We are Ezra, the closest to the library, Avo, the middle child, and Scout, the furthest to the right. And it turns out when you text back, you say which bird you want to talk with more. Well, they all have different personalities. And in fact, they were written partly with local young people in the place to write clever jokes and puns about what would the birds say if you could bring them to life. This is a technology, right, that is available, that is, again, not what we think of when we think about app stores, right? Texting, it's a whole different environment, but it's actually already here. So this is one of those like Ray Kurzweil quotes, the future is already here. It's just not evenly distributed. And by the way, since we're building on the session from games in Africa before, I'll say this technology works in all countries that are using cell phones, which is basically all countries. So this is an incredibly open space that is outside of our imagination. And I would say it's particularly outside the imagination in rich countries, even though there are lots of people that we need to work on. It's very exciting for some of these libraries to make projects like this. Here, they actually made T-shirts that featured the birds. So the characters that they created in the game, they get so excited about that they start doing this kind of work, and it connects them more deeply to the place, right? It's an excuse. The game is an excuse to have a conversation with other people about where are we, what's our history, what is the place. It's not just about an individual looking down at their screen and getting something out of their individual experience. It's about starting something at the place and group level. But here's our first principle: it must be low tech to play. Low tech to play is it has to be in our imagination from the beginning, and thinking about paper as part of the design process, I think is a really essential part. Paper comes in so many forms, though. Okay, here's another place where I think our imagination needs to be much broader. One of the libraries made bookmarks, right? And on the front, it says, summer reading is for everyone. But on the back, it says, art that talks. And if you text in, you start talking with the art objects that are in. So, right, texting doesn't just have to be with a sculpture. You can text with a monument. You can text with a monument that you wish would go away. You can text with a monument that you wish was there. You can anytime texting with an object. So that's one of our atomic units, is like texting with objects, with art, with murals. Another one that we think is interesting, this is a tour. We call this Tour with Trivia. This is a tour that the DC Public Library does every year, where they have a bike ride that goes around to different branches. And on this bike ride, they put together a tour one of the years with our project, where they were featuring libraries that had been named after famous residents, or sometimes renamed, because they said, we don't really want the library named after that person anymore. So we're going through places change, right? And communities have to make sense of that. What is our place? What's our history? Do we want to learn about why it was changed? Is it something to be proud of that we came together and engaged with this library? So this bike ride took a group of bikers. So this is not an individual experience as much as it is a group of 10 bikers might roll in together and to one of the branches, and then they would scan a different QR code at each branch. And each QR code started a conversation about that branch and its history with some trivia. And the trivia is often designed to get people talking to each other. Again, we're looking for social dynamics, not just dynamics for whether the individual learned. I think too often we're doing our assessment at what is the impact on the individual player. Here, we're interested in impact that's on a group of players, or even more importantly, the community. So this was, again, the tour with trivia. You could do it on a bike, but you could do it walking. You could do it a night tour. You could do a secret tour, an underground tour. There's all sorts of tours, right? Libraries actually are often involved with some of the historical research that goes into tours, and libraries are increasingly becoming stops and places that aren't just for books, but are for having these kind of design meetings. Meet in a library. Libraries, I think, are some of the future of democracy. Maybe I'll just take a quick aside to note there are 17,000 plus public libraries in the United States. They are at scale, right? They're at a relatively massive scale. In fact, they are the most widely distributed civic institution at the neighborhood level. So if you want to pick where in democracy should you go to reach 17,000 places, public libraries, I think, are the place to start. Of course, they have very few resources. So the $100 investment point is probably right. We hosted the websites for this. We paid for some of their text messaging, but still, the text messaging costs, it's $1 a month to rent a number, and each message costs on the order of a penny. So it is a cost, just like web hosting can be a cost, but it's I think, a relatively modest cost. It's fun for the libraries to make these projects. Here's a project that I wanted to highlight that came out of Bellows Falls, Vermont. And this is in the atomic unit here is put history in order. So I don't know if you can read it. It might be a little small on your screen, but the top of what the text back to the person: time is running out. Time is out of order and must be set right. This is a kind of narrative structure where you're trying to figure out the pieces of history and how they're assembled, how they're configured. That, of course, it's a great way to take history content and bring it to life. But it's also great to situate it in place. You can see the librarians at left; they're very excited. They're there as part of a whistle stop pride tour that happened along a historic train, where there are different stops on the pride tour where you could learn about how that train station, how it mattered in history. And here we're bringing the content to them, right? This is a little like that bookmobile at the beginning, but here's the librarians. They're so excited to have made something and bring it to this station, bring the library outside the library to the people. And the playful way to engage is a way to go further. And again, have more conversations about it. You can do this very low budget. I did want to mention a kind of fancier example in Washington, D.C. Here's a project called We Who Believe in Freedom. This is in the Crown Jewel Library at the center of the city, and it was made in collaboration by the Women's History Museum. In fact, the curator there basically used our tool to make this herself to bring in one of the voices. The woman at the top right is Katia Stitt. She's part of a group, Sweet Honey in the Rock, which is an incredibly influential group around African American folk music, and has been. I grew up listening to some of their music, and she gives a personal tour where she'll say, "Walk over to this, look at this part of the exhibit. Here's something that you might not see." So it's the idea of even in a fancy exhibit put together by a fancy museum, there's lots of stories that aren't fully told. Can we tell more stories? Can we allow for more layering? And here it begins with a postcard. You start with a postcard that you can use to augment the exhibit. So this is not just augmenting reality. Here we're augmenting museum exhibits. And that kind of augmentation is, in this case, audio. So you can really pay attention with your eyes and read and look, but you're listening on your phone. You're listening to the person's voice as they say, walk a little to the right. What you see is this. And the way to record these, by the way, this is something we learned as part of these templates for libraries, is to record them in the space. Somebody's like, I got a great podcast room at home. Do not do it, right? You're tempted to do the great podcast room, but then all the pacing is off. The feel of presence is off. So how do libraries do this without making a lot of those mistakes? Can we help them skip over to a higher level of practice by telling them, record it in the place, get the place quiet, go on a little walking tour, record a couple of versions, and then cut those up. Record it like you are talking with somebody else in the same room so that it feels more like a podcast in that sense than like a recorded lecture, because that conversational style is really useful. The interactivity, what's the interactivity in game design you can do with this? Push 1 for this, push 2 if you think that's the answer, push 3 if you want to be sent to a random thing. We can do random generation, we can do questions, we can do variables. You can do all sorts of things you do to make meaningful choices in all games with audio, that just like you can with print. Another mechanic that we wanted to highlight as a recipe that we think libraries can use is the I Spy mechanic. I Spy uses the camera of your phone. And here's a library in Spooner, Wisconsin that did a story walk remix. A lot of libraries were doing these story walks where they take a book. Here they took the City Shapes book. It's a kid's book. It's about seeing shapes in your natural environment. They took this book, they take pictures of a bunch of the pages, and they put them on signposts outside the library. That's what libraries are doing at pretty huge scale. Libraries are doing a lot of these with books, right? Taking the pages. That happened during the pandemic because people couldn't go inside the library, but they realized it's a way to be out in physical space. And I think we can do so much better than just taking photocopies of a book. We can do interactive things on that space. And so this project took the book, and because it was about shapes and seeing them in your environment, they invited and challenged people to identify some of those shapes in their own city, to reflect on the architecture, the design, and the history of that place. Here's one of the pictures that was sent in. It was looking for a circle. And they see this picture that was the door opening. How does that handicapped circle change the architecture? Maybe the original architects didn't have that in their drawings, but it's part of the experience of the space, which you can see with your own phone and your own camera and capture that. So the I Spy photo collecting, we think of as kind of an atomic unit that libraries can build on. A recipe, they can build a recipe around that. Start with this piece. You can mix and match different things to make it into an experience. For the library, it has to be pretty easy to make too. So the investment isn't just cost, but they don't have a lot of time. Librarians also are often working the desk job. Well, one of the things that we're discovering through our research is that they don't just have an extra person who's the game design person, right? That person has to be on the desk answering questions. But maybe they have a little break. They have a little time where they could do something on the side. So we've really appraised that not just in terms of money, but in terms of time as the investment. And that's our second principle, which is it has to be low investment to make. So low tech to play and a low investment to make are our first two principles around these games. So I then want to, what does it look like for it to be a low investment to make? Often it means reusing the things that are right near the library or the assets that it already has. In this case, this was a group that was working in the Grand Ledge Area District Library in Michigan, and they had this cool statue of a cat out front. And the cat uses a lot of cat puns. Positively fantastic. Right behind me is the first building built in Grand Ledge as a library in 1931. So a lot of libraries actually were excited to tell the story of their library. Where did they come from? What's their value to the community? What are some of the things that they offer? And that's a fine place to begin. It has to, but it's also an example of them using what they already have, reusing existing assets, keeping that investment low in terms of time as well as cost. Some libraries have cool things. In fact, I would argue almost every place has cool things that distinguish it. Sometimes it's a really cool thing like a caboose. This library had a historic caboose sitting next to the library, and they made a story game that was called Ghost of the Caboose, a spooky story led by a friendly ghost. And I think that this, for us, is a little bit different than the idea of texting with a sculpture, an object. It's texting with a mythological creature. A ghost is great for history, of course, but this can be any sort of fantastical creature. And the design includes this table. I want to just draw our attention to this table. This isn't just cute marketing that happened afterward. It's a core part of the experience. It's how a lot of people discovered it was on Halloween. They made the experience for Halloween, and they were out on the streets when a lot of people were walking around, and they were telling them about it. Here, come chat with the ghost of the caboose. So like a lot of place-based things, they are driven by dates, by festivals. July 4th, what happens on July 4th? When do we come together as a community? When do we reflect on our history? And I would argue that game design should be made for those moments, should be made for those places as much as they are just made for the web. You may be tempted to fall into, oh, anywhere, anytime is great, right? That's the future. Actually, that's not the place we want to live in, right? I don't want to live anywhere, anytime. I want to live in my town, and I want to wake up in the morning, and I want to go to bed at night. We want certain times, and I don't want to meet with my neighbors anywhere, anytime. I don't want to have to talk to them on the street all the time, but there are certain times I really want to talk with them. So this is, I think, part of just recognizing how place and space works, right? And matching that rather than try and fall into a false notion of anywhere, anytime. Complexity can come out of this simplicity. It starts simple. We told this Ghost of the Caboose folks, just make a very simple story. Have the ghost say a couple things. What they built looks more like this. If you're in our editor, these are all the different things it could say and how they branch and connect. And if we had ever shown them this at the beginning, they would have refused to do the project. But they kept wanting to add more bits of dialogue. What if the ghost says this? What if the ghost does this? Adding more complexity around it. And I think that's part of also the fun. What starts in a simple way can become complex, just like a place. Somebody moves there first, somebody else moves and becomes their neighbor, and then there's one neighbor, and complexity grows. Of course, quite often there were neighbors there before you came, and places also have to reconcile. What does it mean to enter a place that's already been there? Here's a project that was doing that. In the Casa Peralta tiles was something in front of a building near, I think this might have been a library or it was right near the library. The librarian was investigating these tiles as part of making the game. So I wanted to let you hear their words.
Just getting to even walk around outside and make this little scavenger hunt was really enjoyable. And I got to look at the tiles a lot harder than I'd ever looked at them before. So I learned a lot in the process too.
For anyone that's ever studied youth game making programs, one of the things that it always struck me is that the people making the game learn way more than anyone playing it, right? So if we really want to maximize learning, we want to have everyone making games, not playing them, right? The playing should be secondary because you learn way more by making them than by playing them. And I think this is an interesting notion. By democratizing game design, by having a lot more places making the game, we're getting closer to learning our own history deeply. The librarians learn their history, but also the librarians shouldn't just be making them for their community. They should be inviting the community in to make the games together. Our tool for doing this, Hive Mechanic, is open source and free. It's out there, but it requires installing on a server, which not a lot of libraries can. We're playing with different models for being a nonprofit or how that could work. But in some ways, I'm more interested in the design process and getting more folks involved in whatever. There are other free tools out there, and we're as equally excited about people using those and making messy diagrams. Like this is the Arrowhead library made this great diagram for planning their story, right? Using Post-its to write your story, not a digital space, is in some ways way more inclusive for bringing the community in, showing the process and how it works. Others are doing more physical things. This is the Montclair Public Library. They made a storytelling box right? And it's just using an existing laptop with slides, and the touchscreen jumps to different slides. Libraries have been doing slide-based storytelling for a long time, but not always thinking of them as kiosks you can make. And with the makerspace in the library and cardboard, you can do some fun things there. I wanted to close by reminding us that the impact is often at the group level. This is the Brookings Historical Texting Tour project, and this is what they said to say about it.
We chose to do this project because we wanted to build a stronger relationship with our downtown Brookings organization and find ways to get the community involved in community history.
So the relationships built between the library, the town government, the historical society, this is at the associational level. And scholars of democracy say that strong places have these ties between associations. The library can't be in isolation. And this design process of making games actually connects the library better to the city, to activist organizations, to citizen groups. I think that's a really exciting outcome that we are measuring as well. And so the last principle, therefore, is we need stronger places, and we need games that are strengthening the place, not just strengthening the players. Yes, we want to strengthen the players, empower players, but also let's have stronger places coming out of these as well. We have a report coming out. If you want to get notified when our report comes out, add your email to our notification list, and we'll let you know when it comes out there. We have a kind of a recipes report for that libraries could use. Or we're going to be up at 1 o'clock-ish at the networking hour. Bring your lunch up if you want to brown bag it with us and chat about games and place and cities. So thank you, and keep playing locally, but also keep making locally as well. All right.